My sister walked into probate court wearing a dress worth more than my annual salary, convinced I was the only obstacle between her and $500 million. She treated our grandfather's death like a mere administrative hurdle, but she was wrong. The real threat was the stranger in the back row holding a black leather briefcase. They thought they came here to claim an inheritance, but they actually arrived to sign their own destruction. My name is Alberta Kingsley. I sat on the hard, polished bench of the Cook County Probate Court, a room that smelled of lemon furniture oil and the stale, recycled air of 1,000 broken promises. At 32 years old, I had become accustomed to the sensation of being invisible. A ghost in my own family history, I was a restorer of antique books by trade, a profession that required me to be quiet, meticulous, and comfortable with the dust of the past. Today, however, the past was not resting in a leather binding on my workbench. It was sitting 3 rows ahead of me, wearing a white Armani suit that probably cost more than the down payment on my apartment. The courtroom was a theater of brown hues, mahogany tables, oak panels, and the beige walls of bureaucracy. It was designed to intimidate, to remind you that the law was heavy and ancient. But for the people sitting at the plaintiff's table, this room was just another boardroom, another venue for a transaction. My sister, Victoria Kingsley, sat with the posture of a queen who had already been crowned. She was 36 years old and the CEO of Velvet Horizon, a real estate conglomerate that our grandfather had built from grit and steel, and which she was currently turning into a brand of soulless, glass-walled luxury condos. Victoria did not look like a grieving granddaughter. She looked like a capital investment. She was the embodiment of quiet luxury, that modern aesthetic that screams wealth by whispering it. There were no logos on her clothes, no garish branding that would betray a need for validation. Her suit was a pristine, architectural white, tailored to within a millimeter of her life. Her sweater was likely cashmere from a specific herd of goats in Mongolia that were brushed only by monks. On her wrist sat a watch that looked simple to the untrained eye, but was worth $40,000. She radiated a terrifying, sanitized perfection, a visual argument that she was competent, rational, and deserving. Behind her sat our parents, Robert and Eleanor Kingsley. They did not turn around to look at me. They had not looked at me, really looked at me, in nearly a decade. My mother was wearing a navy dress that was tasteful and severe, her face pulled tight by the best surgeons in Zurich, leaving her with an expression of permanent, mild surprise. My father checked his phone under the table, his movements jerky and irritated. To them, I was not a daughter. I was a glitch in the system, a clerical error that had somehow survived into adulthood without acquiring the necessary ambition or greed to fit into the family portrait. They sat like vultures in cashmere, waiting for the carcass to be carved. The carcass in question was the estate of Silas Kingsley, my grandfather. $500 million. It was a number so large it felt abstract. Like the distance to the moon, it comprised commercial real estate in downtown Chicago, a portfolio of blue-chip stocks, offshore holdings, and the Kingsley family estate in Lake Forest, for Victoria. However, it was not abstract, it was oxygen. "Your Honor, if I may," said Mr. Vance, Victoria's lead attorney. Vance was a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a facility that produced high-end lawyers. He was tan, silver-haired, and possessed a voice that sounded like gravel wrapped in silk. He stood at the podium, arranging his papers with a performative slowness. Judge Holloway sat behind the high bench, looking down at the proceedings with the exhaustion of a man who had spent 30 years refereeing disputes between rich people who hated each other. He rubbed his temples, his eyes scanning the file in front of him. I could see the weariness in the slope of his shoulders. To him, we were just another docket number, another hour to kill before lunch. "Proceed, Mr. Vance," Judge Holloway said, his voice flat. "Thank you, Your Honor," Vance began, turning slightly to ensure his profile was visible to the non-existent gallery, We are here today to expedite the probate process for the estate of the late Silas Kingsley. My client, Victoria Kingsley, is the primary executor named in the will dated 4 years ago. Given the complexity of the Kingsley Enterprises holdings and the volatile nature of the current real estate market, we are requesting an immediate transfer of control regarding the liquid assets and the voting shares of the company. Vance paused for effect, letting the phrase immediate transfer hang in the air. The rationale is simple, Your Honor. Vance continued, his hand sweeping toward Victoria as if presenting a prize show poodle. Ms. Kingsley has been running the daily operations of the company for the last 5 years. The markets are jittery. Any delay in the transition of ownership could spook investors and devalue the estate by millions of dollars. Time is, quite literally, money in this instance. We have projects in development that require immediate capital injection, projects that the late Mr. Kingsley championed. That was a lie. Grandfather hated Victoria's new projects. He called them glass coffins for yuppies. But the dead cannot testify. And Vance knew it. And what of the other potential beneficiary? Judge Holloway asked, glancing at the paperwork. There is another granddaughter, correct? An Alberta Kingsley? Vance's expression shifted to one of practiced pity. It was a look I knew well. It was the same look my mother gave friends when they asked why I wasn't at the country club. Yes, Your Honor, Vance said, lowering his voice to a tone of confidential regret. Alberta is present today. He did not point at me. He simply gestured vaguely toward the back of the room, as if I were a stain on the wall. However, the family believes, and the previous will reflects, that Miss Alberta is not suited for the burden of managing such significant assets. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. I was wearing a gray wool skirt and a black turtleneck, clothes that were clean, warm, and entirely unpretentious. I had no diamonds, no Italian leather. I felt the heat rise in my neck, but I did not move. Not suited? Judge Holloway asked, peering over his reading glasses. Regrettably, no, Vance said. Miss Alberta has chosen a life of seclusion. She works with old books. She has no experience in finance, no understanding of corporate governance, and frankly, Your Honor, she has a history of financial and psychological instability. The words hung in the silence. Instability. It was a masterful stroke. They didn't need to prove I was crazy. They just needed to paint me as fragile, a delicate, broken thing that needed to be protected from the weight of $500 million. If I was unstable, then cutting me out was an act of mercy, not theft. I watched Victoria. From the back, she looked like a statue of composure. Her shoulders were square, her head held high. But I was the one person in the world who knew her tells. I had grown up across the hall from her. I knew the sound of her breathing when she was lying. I knew the way she blinked when she was calculating. And I saw it now. Her left hand was resting on the mahogany table, hidden from the judge's line of sight by her own body, but visible to me. Her index finger was tapping against the wood. Tap, 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 fast, rhythmic, frantic. It was a small motion, a micro-tremor in the facade of perfection. Victoria Kingsley never fidgeted. She was a woman who could sit through a 3-hour board meeting without shifting in her chair. She cultivated stillness because stillness was power. The only time Victoria tapped her finger like that was when she was cornered, when the math didn't add up, when the walls were closing in. Why was she so nervous? Vance was winning. The judge looked bored and ready to sign. The narrative was established. The competent, powerful CEO sister versus the fragile, poor, book-binding sister. It was a slam dunk. They were minutes away from total control. So why was she tapping? I looked closer. Narrowing my eyes, it wasn't just impatience, it was desperation. Vance was talking about capital injection and liquidity. He was pushing hard for the cash, not just the stock. They wanted the accounts unlocked today, not next week, not next month, today. Suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle clicked together in my mind, sharp and cold. The rumors I had read in the financial columns about Velvet Horizon being overleveraged, the way my father had been selling off his classic cars quietly over the last 6 months, the frantic, hushed phone calls I had overheard at the funeral reception when they thought I was in the bathroom. They weren't here to expand the empire. They were here to save it from drowning. Victoria wasn't tapping her finger because she was eager to lead. She was tapping because she was broke. They were all broke. The quiet luxury was a costume. The Armani suit was armor over a decaying body. They needed grandfather's $500 million not to build, but to cover a hole so deep they could never climb out of it on their own. Miss Alberta is currently living in a rented apartment in a less than desirable neighborhood, Vance was saying, twisting the knife. We believe that granting her access to such wealth would be dangerous to her own well-being. The family is willing to set up a modest stipend, controlled by Victoria, to ensure she is cared for without the stress of management. A stipend, an allowance, like a child. Judge Holloway sighed, a long, rattling sound that seemed to deflate the room. He picked up his pen. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was almost noon. He wanted a sandwich. He wanted this over. It seems straightforward enough, the judge muttered. If the will from 4 years ago is the standing document, and there are valid concerns about the competency of the other potential heir. Victoria stopped tapping. Her body went rigid with anticipation. She was leaning forward slightly, like a predator about to snap its jaws. My mother reached out and touched my father's arm. They held their breath. I felt a strange calm wash over me. It was the same calm I felt when I opened a 300-year-old Bible that had been soaked in water and eaten by mold. You don't panic when you see the damage. You just assess the structure. You look for the thread that holds the spine together. I knew something they didn't. I knew that grandfather, a man who built his fortune by reading people, had read them perfectly. However, Judge Holloway said, pausing, he looked up and scanned the room, his eyes finally landing on me. For the first time, the entire room turned. Victoria turned her head, just a fraction, enough for me to see the sharp angle of her cheekbone and the cold, dead hostility in her blue eyes. Mr. Vance adjusted his cufflinks, giving me a dismissive glance. My parents stared at me with a mixture of annoyance and pity. I sat up straight. I did not smooth my skirt. I did not touch my hair. I let my hands rest, steady and still, on my lap. I was the only person in this room who was not pretending to be something else. Miss Kingsley, Judge Holloway said, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. You are the granddaughter, Alberta Kingsley? I am, Your Honor, I said. My voice was not loud, but it was clear. It did not tremble. You have heard the motion presented by Mr. Vance, the judge said, leaning back in his leather chair. They are asking for immediate probate of the will and transfer of assets to your sister, Victoria Kingsley. They have made claims regarding your suitability. The judge waited, perhaps expecting me to cry, or to shout, or to shrink away. Miss Kingsley, he asked, and the weight of the $500 million seemed to press down on the air between us. Do you object to this request? I forced my legs to straighten. The muscles in my thighs burned with a mixture of adrenaline and phantom fatigue, the kind that comes not from physical exertion, but from the sheer emotional weight of the moment. I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely at odds with the frantic energy radiating from the plaintiff's table. I felt the wooden bench leave the backs of my legs, and for the first time in 10 years, I was standing on my own 2 feet in front of them. I object, Your Honor. My voice did not boom. It did not echo with theatrical resonance. It was flat, hard, and terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of someone who had spent a decade in silent rooms, repairing things that other people had broken. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the courtroom. Then came the sound. It was sharp, short, and cruel. A laugh. Not a full-bellied laugh, but an expulsion of air through the nose, high-pitched and dismissive. Victoria. She did not turn around to face me. She simply leaned toward our mother, her white Armani shoulder brushing against my mother's navy silk. "I told you," Victoria whispered, though in the acoustic perfection of the courtroom, it carried like a shout. "I told you she would make a scene. She cannot help herself. Mr. Vance did not miss a beat. He was a professional, a man whose entire career was built on smoothing over the jagged edges of reality. He turned his body slightly, creating a physical barrier between the judge and me, effectively cutting me out of the frame. "Your Honor," Vance said, his tone dripping with a paternal sort of exhaustion, "this objection is baseless. As we have already established, Miss Alberta has no standing here. We are discussing the execution of a valid will and the urgent financial stewardship of a major corporation. We cannot allow emotional outbursts from estranged family members to derail legal proceedings." He paused, glancing at his watch, a subtle gesture meant to remind the judge that his time was expensive and limited. "Miss Alberta presents no legal evidence," Vance continued, his voice hardening. "She presents no counter-document. She presents no medical testimony to refute the competency of the deceased. This is simply a delay tactic. Your Honor, it is the last grasp of someone who feels left out. While tragic, it is not a legal argument. We ask that you strike the objection and proceed with the signing." Judge Holloway looked at me. He had removed his glasses and was rubbing the bridge of his nose, pinching the skin between his eyes as if trying to ward off a migraine. He looked at the paperwork in front of him, then at the clock, and finally at me. He did not look angry. He looked bored. He looked like a man who wanted to go to the deli across the street and eat a pastrami sandwich in peace. "Miss Kingsley," the judge said, his voice heavy with skepticism, "you are objecting to the motion for immediate probate. That is a serious action. You are implying that the documents before me are invalid or that the process is flawed." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench. "Mr. Vance is correct on one point," the judge said. "You cannot simply object because you are unhappy with the outcome. This is a court of law, not a therapy session. If you wish to stop this train, you need to put something on the tracks. Do you have evidence to submit? Do you have a rival will? Do you have anything other than your own word?" I looked at the judge. Then I looked at the back of my father's head. His neck was red, a flush creeping up from his collar. He was angry. He hated embarrassment more than he hated poverty, and right now, I was embarrassing him. I took a breath. The basis for my objection does not lie with me. "Your Honor," I said. Victoria scoffed again. This time she turned her head, shooting a glare over her shoulder that was pure venom. Her eyes were wide, the whites visible all around the iris. It was the look of a trapped animal. "Then where is it?" Vance demanded, breaking protocol and addressing me directly. "If you have evidence, produce it. If you have a document, show it. Otherwise, sit down." I ignored him. I kept my eyes locked on Judge Holloway. "It is on its way," I said. The room seemed to tilt. The sheer absurdity of the statement hung in the air. "It is on its way." It sounded like a child making excuses for unfinished homework. Judge Holloway blinked. "On its way?" he repeated. "Miss Kingsley, this hearing was scheduled 3 weeks ago. If you had materials to submit, the deadline for filing was 48 hours ago. You cannot simply ask the court to pause because you claim something is coming in the mail. It is not in the mail," I said. "It is walking through the front door of this building right now." A ripple of irritation went through the room. The court reporter stopped typing and looked up. The bailiff shifted his weight, his hand resting idly near his belt. The atmosphere shifted from tense to annoyed. I was wasting their time. I was the crazy sister, the black sheep who could not accept reality. My father stood up. He did not ask for permission. He simply shot out of his chair, the wood scraping loudly against the floor. He turned to face me, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and humiliation. He looked older than I remembered. The skin around his jaw was slack, and there were deep lines etched into his forehead, but his eyes were the same, cold, hard, disappointed. "Enough, Alberta," he snapped, his voice cracked slightly, betraying his stress. Just stop it. Haven't you done enough? You are humiliating yourself. You are humiliating us." He gestured around the empty room, as if thousands of people were watching. "Don't waste everyone's time with your fantasies." He hissed, "Sit down. Be quiet. Keep the last shred of dignity you have left." The word hung there. Dignity. I looked at him, really looked at him. For most of my life, this man had been a titan. His approval was the sun, and his disapproval was a long, dark winter. I had spent 20 years trying to be quiet enough, smart enough, and good enough to earn a nod from him. I had made myself small so he could feel big, but now, standing in this cold courtroom, I saw the truth. He was not a titan. He was a man in a suit he could no longer afford, desperate to get his hands on his father's money because he had failed to make his own. He was terrified. He was sweating. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. The fear was gone. The awe was gone. All that was left was a dull, aching pity. Dignity is the only thing I have left. "Father," I said. My voice was soft, but in the silence, it carried the weight of a gavel strike. I saw him flinch. He hadn't expected me to speak back. I never spoke back. And that is exactly why I'm sitting here. I continued, my gaze unyielding. Because if I walk out that door and let you sign these papers, I will lose that too. I will not let you steal the truth along with the money. My father opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at Victoria, then at Vance, helpless. He sat down slowly, deflated. Vance saw the shift. He saw the judge watching the family dynamic with a furrowed brow. He knew that sympathy was a dangerous variable in a courtroom. He needed to crush this now. He needed to close the deal before the judge started asking questions about why a father would snap at his daughter like that. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice loud and authoritative, cutting through the emotional fog. "This is exactly what I was referring to. The instability, the drama. We are witnessing a family breakdown, not a legal argument. I move that we disregard this interruption. The estate is bleeding money every hour we delay. The shareholders of Kingsley Enterprises are waiting for a signal of stability." Vance picked up the order, holding it out like a weapon. "We need to sign the order of transfer. Now, for the good of the company. For the good of the employees whose jobs depend on swift leadership, we cannot hold a $500 million corporation hostage because one beneficiary is having a breakdown." Victoria leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. She did not look at me anymore. She stared at the judge, her eyes burning with intensity. "Please, Your Honor," Victoria said. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor underneath it, a vibration of pure panic. "My grandfather wanted me to lead. He trained me for this. Every second we wait is an insult to his memory. Just sign the papers, please." Judge Holloway looked at the papers. Then he looked at his watch. It was 12 past 12. He picked up his pen. He tapped it against the desk. "I understand the urgency. Mr. Vance," the judge said, "and the court is not inclined to indulge in delays without cause." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Wait," I thought, "just wait." The judge looked at me one last time. His eyes were not unkind, but they were firm. "Miss Kingsley, unless you can produce a document right this second, I have no choice but to rule on the motion before me. The law deals in facts, not promises of future arrivals." He looked down at the document. He positioned the pen. Victoria let out a breath, a sound that was half sob, half laugh. She reached for a pen from her own bag, ready to sign the moment the judge finished. Her movements were jerky, feverish. She was already spending the money in her head. She was already paying off the loans, covering the losses, burying the secrets. Vance smiled. It was a small, tight smile of victory. I stood there, my hands clenched at my sides. I did not look at the door. I did not turn around. I just held my breath and counted. 1. The judge lowered the pen to the paper. 2. The ink tip touched the signature line. 3. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom did not bang open. There was no dramatic crash. There was only the distinct, heavy click of the latch retracting, followed by the smooth, hydraulic hiss of the hinges. It was a sound of absolute authority. The air in the room changed instantly. It was a physical shift, as if someone had opened a window in a submarine. The pressure dropped. Judge Holloway stopped. The pen froze a millimeter from the paper. He looked up. Victoria froze. Her hand hovered over the table. Her fingers curled like claws. She turned slowly, her neck stiff, dread written in the set of her jaw. Vance turned, his smile vanishing like smoke. My parents turned. I did not turn. I let out the breath I had been holding. I watched the judge's face. I watched his eyes widen, not with recognition, but with surprise. Footsteps echoed on the marble floor. They were slow, rhythmic, and heavy, the sound of expensive leather hitting stone with a cadence that suggested the owner owned the ground he walked on. Click, clack, click, clack. The sound was singular. There was no hesitation in the stride. I finally allowed myself to smile. It was a small smile, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. The basis for my objection had arrived. He was a man who seemed to absorb the light around him. He stood in the center of the aisle, a solitary figure against the beige backdrop of the courtroom doors. He was approximately 45 years old, though his face possessed a kind of ageless, granite quality that made guessing difficult. He was not handsome in the way a movie star is handsome. He was striking in the way a cliff face or a predatory bird is striking. There was a geometry to his features, sharp cheekbones, a jawline that could cut glass, and eyes that were set deep beneath a heavy brow. But it was the suit that held my attention, in a room filled with expensive clothing. His attire operated on an entirely different frequency. Victoria's white Armani suit was loud. It screamed for attention, demanding to be recognized as high fashion. Mr. Vance's pinstripes were a costume of authority. Designed to intimidate, this man's suit was simply absolute. It was black, but not the shiny, synthetic black of a department store rack, nor the glossy midnight blue of a gala tuxedo. It was a matte, profound black, like the deepest part of the ocean where light dares not go. It was cut with a precision that suggested it had not been made for a body type, but for this specific man, mapped to his musculature down to the millimeter. There were no labels. There were no cufflinks flashing gold or diamonds. There was no watch peeking out from the sleeve to signal his net worth. He wore no jewelry at all. He carried only a briefcase. It was made of black leather, matte and smooth, without a single visible logo. It looked soft enough to be calfskin, but durable enough to stop a bullet. He did not pause to acknowledge the room. He did not look at the gallery, which was empty save for a bored bailiff. He did not look at me. Most importantly, he did not look at the Kingsleys. He began to walk. The sound of his footsteps on the marble floor was rhythmic and deliberate. Thud, thud, thud. It was not a hurry. It was an arrival. The atmosphere in the room underwent an immediate and violent shift. The air, which had been thick with the humidity of family drama and desperate greed, suddenly became cold and thin. It was the change in pressure that happens when an apex predator enters a clearing. The gazelles stopped grazing. The birds stopped singing. I watched Victoria. Her reaction was a masterclass in cognitive dissonance. She turned fully in her chair, her arm draped over the back, and her eyes narrowed. She scanned him from shoes to haircut, her brain trying to categorize him into her limited filing system of useful people and obstacles. She couldn't place him. He wasn't one of the flashy litigators she saw at charity galas. He wasn't a politician. "Who is that?" she whispered to Mr. Vance. The acoustics of the silent room carried her voice, sharp and irritated. "Is that another lawyer she hired? Did she sell her books to pay for a shark?" She sounded offended, as if my hiring legal counsel was a personal insult to her intelligence. Mr. Vance did not answer her immediately. He was staring at the man, and his expression was very different from Victoria's. Vance was a veteran of the legal trenches. He knew the smell of money, real money, not the leveraged, debt-heavy money that Victoria played with. He looked at the man's suit, the way he moved, the terrifying neutrality of his expression. Vance shook his head, a small, jerky motion. The blood had drained slightly from his face, leaving his tanned skin looking sallow. "No," Vance whispered back, his voice tight. "That is not a lawyer. Lawyers carry files. This guy is carrying a verdict. My father." Sensing the shift in Vance's mood, leaned forward. "Who is he then? Security?" Vance didn't answer. He just watched, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if bracing for impact. The man walked past the plaintiff's table. He was close enough that the wind of his passing disturbed the papers on Vance's desk. He did not glance down. He treated them with the ultimate disrespect. He ignored them completely. To him, Victoria Kingsley and her $500 million ambition were as insignificant as dust motes floating in a sunbeam. He walked straight to the clerk's desk, which sat just below the judge's high bench. He stopped. He placed the black briefcase on the desk. He did not open it immediately. He rested his hand on the leather for a second, a gesture of ownership and control. Then, with a single, fluid motion, he clicked the latch. It made a sound like a pistol being cocked. He reached inside and withdrew a single, thick envelope. It was cream-colored, heavy bond paper, sealed not with wax, but with a red security tape that looked official and tamper-proof. He turned his head slightly, addressing the bench. "For the court," he said. His voice was a physical thing. It was a baritone so deep it seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It was devoid of regional accent, devoid of emotion, and utterly commanded the space. It was a voice that did not ask for permission to speak. It simply stated facts. Judge Holloway had been watching the man's approach with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Now, he leaned forward, peering over his spectacles. "And who are you, exactly?" the judge asked. "You are interrupting a probate hearing, sir. Unless you are a party to this case, I suggest you step back." The man did not step back. He did not apologize. He simply placed the envelope on the high ledge of the judge's bench, sliding it forward until it rested directly under Judge Holloway's nose. "I am Arthur Mercer," the man said. The name meant nothing to Victoria. She rolled her eyes, checking her watch again, clearly calculating how much this dramatic interlude was costing her in billable hours. But the man continued, "I am a senior trust officer, representing the International Fiduciary Office of Sterling and Graves." The reaction was instantaneous. Judge Holloway froze. His hand, which had been reaching for his water glass, stopped in midair. His eyes, previously clouded with fatigue, snapped wide open. He looked at the man, Arthur Mercer, with a sudden, intense recognition that bordered on shock. "Sterling and Graves?" the judge repeated. His voice had lost its authoritative bark. It sounded smaller, almost respectful. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap, for the average person, or even for a standard millionaire like my father. The names Sterling and Graves meant nothing. They did not have branches on street corners. They did not run commercials during the Super Bowl. They did not offer credit cards or mortgages. But in the world of high finance, in the rarefied air where billionaires and sovereigns move their assets, Sterling and Graves was a legend. They were not a bank. They were a fortress, founded in London 200 years ago. They specialized in one thing: the absolute, bulletproof protection of dynastic wealth. They managed the trusts of European royalty, industrial tycoons, and families whose names were etched into the foundations of the global economy. They were famous for two things: their exorbitant fees and their impenetrable secrecy. They did not get involved in messy public court battles. If Sterling and Graves was in the room, it meant the situation had escalated far beyond a simple will dispute. Vance let out a soft sound, like air escaping a punctured tire. "Oh, God." Victoria looked at him, annoyed. "What? Who are they? Why do you look like you're about to vomit?" "They are the cleaners." Victoria, Vance hissed, not bothering to whisper anymore. They don't handle wills. They handle empires. If they are here, the money isn't where you think it is. Arthur Mercer ignored the whispering. He kept his gaze fixed on the judge. We are acting as the sole trustee for the assets of the late Silas Kingsley. Mercer stated, the document before you supersedes all previous filings. Judge Holloway looked at the envelope as if it were a bomb. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. The room was so silent I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Victoria stood up. Objections died in her throat as Mercer turned his head just an inch, his peripheral vision locking onto her. It was a warning. Sit down. She didn't sit, but she didn't speak. She looked at the envelope in the judge's hands, and for the first time, genuine fear began to crack the porcelain mask of her face. Judge Holloway broke the seal. The sound of the heavy paper tearing was violent in the stillness. Rip! He pulled out a document. It was bound in blue backing paper. He unfolded it. He began to read. I watched his face. I saw his eyes scan the header, then dart down to the first paragraph. I saw his eyebrows shoot up toward his hairline. He read the first page, then quickly flipped to the second, his reading speed increasing as the implications of the text hit him. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked up at Mercer, then back at the document, verifying the signatures, checking the dates. This is dated 6 months ago, the judge stammered. Correct, Mercer said. It was executed in our Zurich office, with full consular witnessing. Judge Holloway slumped back in his chair. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a profound, stunned clarity. He looked like a man who had been trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle only to realize he had been given the pieces to a completely different game. He took a deep breath and removed his glasses, setting them down on the bench with a clatter. He turned his gaze toward the plaintiff's table. He looked at Victoria, standing there in her white suit, clutching her purse as if it contained her soul. He looked at my parents, who were frozen in a tableau of confusion. The judge's expression was no longer bored. It wasn't angry. It was something far worse. It was pity. He looked at them with the sympathetic embarrassment one might feel for a child who runs onto a stage thinking it is their turn to sing, only to realize the show ended an hour ago. Mrs. Kingsley. Mr. Vance, the judge said, his voice quiet but echoing off the wood paneling. Victoria stepped forward, her voice shrill. What is it? What does that paper say? We have a valid will. We have the priority filing. Judge Holloway shook his head slowly. I am afraid, the judge said, placing his hand flat over the document Mercer had given him, that we have all been laboring under a significant delusion. He looked directly at Victoria. We have misunderstood the nature of this hearing entirely. He said, You are asking this court to transfer assets that this court has absolutely no jurisdiction over. In fact, you are fighting over a corpse that has already been buried. The judge picked up the document and held it up. This is not a probate case anymore, he declared. Victoria's face went gray. What does that mean? It means, Arthur Mercer said, speaking for the first time to my sister, his voice like a gavel striking stone, that you are not here to receive an inheritance. Ms. Kingsley, you are trespassing. Judge Holloway set the document down on the mahogany bench. The sound of the paper touching the wood was soft, almost imperceptible, yet it resonated with the finality of a coffin lid closing. He folded his hands over the file, interlocking his fingers, and looked down at the assembly with a gaze that had been stripped of all patience. The petition for probate is dismissed, the judge announced. His voice was dry, devoid of the theatricality that Vance had been trying to inject into the proceedings. It was a statement of administrative fact. The assets of the late Silas Kingsley are not subject to the jurisdiction of this court, he continued. There is no estate to probate. There is no inheritance to distribute. As of this moment, the case number assigned to this file is void. The silence that followed was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of a vacuum, the kind that exists immediately after a catastrophic structural failure. Then, the vacuum collapsed. Mr. Vance shot out of his chair. The smooth, oiled motion of the high-priced litigator was gone. He moved with a jerky, frantic energy, his chair legs screeching against the floor. "Your Honor, that is impossible," Vance shouted. He forgot to say object. He forgot to adjust his tie. He pointed a trembling finger at the bench. "A cardinal sin in courtroom etiquette. My client is the sole heir under the will dated 4 years ago. We have the original copy. It was notarized, witnessed, and filed. You cannot simply dismiss a $500 million estate based on a piece of paper handed over by a stranger." Vance was sweating. I could see a bead of perspiration track its way down from his temple, cutting through his spray tan. He knew what was happening. He was billing Victoria by the hour, but he was also counting on a percentage of the settlement. If there was no estate, there was no payout. Arthur Mercer did not look at Vance. He did not turn his head. He did not blink. He stood by the clerk's desk, his posture reminiscent of a guard at Buckingham Palace. If the guard was wearing a $5,000 suit and radiated the menace of a loaded weapon. "The will you are referencing is a historical curiosity, Mr. Vance," Mercer said. His voice cut through Vance's shouting like a scalpel through fat. It was low, resonant, and terrifyingly calm. "It has the same legal weight as a grocery list." Mercer continued. "The last will and testament of Silas Kingsley was formally revoked 6 months ago. At that same time, Mr. Kingsley executed a transfer of deed and title for every single asset he possessed." Mercer tapped the black leather briefcase with one finger. "The real estate portfolio, the stock holdings, the offshore accounts, the intellectual property rights, the family home in Lake Forest, even the furniture inside it. Everything was moved into a blind trust." The words blind trust hit the room like physical blows. I watched my sister. Victoria had been pale before, but now she looked as if her blood had stopped circulating entirely. Her mouth opened, her lips dry and trembling. She knew what those words meant. She had an MBA. She knew exactly what a blind trust was. And more importantly, she knew exactly what it was not. It was not a bank account she could access. It was not a portfolio she could borrow against. It was not an asset she could list on a balance sheet to calm her nervous creditors. A blind trust meant the assets were locked away, managed by a third party, in this case. The iron-fisted Sterling and Graves, with absolutely no input, control, or visibility from the beneficiaries. It meant she couldn't touch the money. But more fastidiously, it meant she couldn't promise the money. Victoria had been floating her failing real estate empire on promises. She had been telling banks, investors, and contractors that as soon as grandfather died, she would have the liquidity to pay them all. She had leveraged a future she did not own, and now, that future had just been deleted. "Mercer, why did he do this?" Victoria whispered. The sound was small, stripped of all her usual arrogance. Mercer turned to her. It was a slow, mechanical pivot. "Mr. Kingsley was a man of immense foresight." Mercer said, "He observed the behavior of his potential heirs over the last decade. He saw the spending. He saw the debts. He saw the ambition that outpaced the talent." Mercer paused, letting the insult land. He anticipated that upon his death, there would be a feeding frenzy. He knew there would be lawsuits, challenges, and attempts to dismantle his legacy for quick cash. So, he removed the temptation. He transferred ownership to us. The judge cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the bench. He picked up the blue-back document again, adjusting his glasses to read a specific clause. "Mr. Mercer is correct," Judge Holloway said. He sounded impressed, perhaps even a little amused. "This trust instrument is comprehensive. It explicitly states that the transfer is irrevocable." The judge looked over his glasses at Vance. "Do you understand what that means, counselor? Irrevocable. It means it cannot be undone. It cannot be amended. It cannot be challenged. Once Silas Kingsley died, this trust became a fortress of stone. No one has the power to break it. Not you, not me, and certainly not your client." The word Irrevocable echoed in the high ceiling. It sounded like a prison sentence. Behind Victoria, the reality finally crashed down on my parents. My mother, Eleanor, let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She grabbed the back of Victoria's chair for support. Her face, usually composed in a mask of haughty indifference, crumpled into raw panic. "But we are his family," she cried out. Her voice was shrill, desperate. She stood up, ignoring my father's attempt to pull her back down. She looked at the judge, then at Mercer, her eyes wide and wet. "You cannot do this. We are the Kingsleys. That money belongs to the family. It has always been this way. A bank cannot own our lives." She pointed a shaking hand at Mercer. "Who are you to decide? You are just a suit. You didn't know him. You didn't know how much he loved us. He would never lock us out. He was old. He was confused. He must have thought he was signing something else." She turned to the judge, pleading now. "Your Honor, my father-in-law was a sentimental man. He loved his family. A cold, heartless bank could never understand his true wishes. We know what he wanted. We are his flesh and blood." I sat there, watching my mother perform. It was a compelling performance, if I didn't know better. I might have believed it, but I remembered the Christmas dinners where they ignored him. I remembered the way they rolled their eyes when he told stories about the war. I remembered how they only visited him when the tuition bills for Victoria's private MBA were due. Mercer did not flinch at her outburst. He did not look sympathetic. He did not look annoyed. He looked at her with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. He waited for her to stop gasping for air. "Mrs. Kingsley?" Mercer said. His tone was not loud, but it silenced her instantly. "You are operating under a misconception common among those who confuse proximity with intimacy. You assume that because you share his DNA, you understand his mind. The document I hold suggests otherwise." Mercer took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the railing that separated the gallery from the court. "You appeal to emotion," Mercer said. "You speak of love, of family, of understanding. You think these things are currency in this room. They are not." He held up the black briefcase. "Sterling and Graves does not deal in sentiment. Mrs. Kingsley, we do not deal in interpretations or feelings. We deal in instructions, explicit, written, legally binding instructions." He looked her dead in the eye, and the instructions here are very clear. "Mr. Kingsley did not trust you. He did not trust your husband, and he certainly did not trust your daughter. He believed that if he left his fortune in your hands, it would be squandered within 5 years. Based on the financial reports I have seen regarding your daughter's company, his assessment was generous. It would likely have taken only 3. My mother recoiled as if he had slapped her. My father sat with his head in his hands, his face gray. "Family cares about feelings," Mercer said, delivering the final blow. "We care about orders, and we follow them to the letter." The brutality of the truth was absolute. There was no wiggle room, no negotiation. Victoria slammed her hand down on the table. Bang! The sound was sharp, violent. It startled the bailiff, who took a half-step forward, his hand moving toward his belt. "This is a lie!" Victoria screamed. She spun around, her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. The cool, collected CEO was gone. The quiet luxury was gone. All that was left was a spoiled child who had been told no for the first time in her life. "This is a scam!" she shrieked, pointing at Mercer, then swinging her finger around to point directly at me. "It's her! It's Alberta!" She lunged toward the barrier, her eyes wild. She did this. She brainwashed him. She spent all that time with him in that dusty old library, whispering poison in his ear. She forced him to sign these papers. Victoria looked at the judge, her chest heaving. "Your Honor, my grandfather was 90 years old. He was senile. He didn't know what a blind trust was. Alberta must have tricked him. She probably told him it was a birthday card. This is fraud. This is elder abuse." She grabbed Vance by the lapels of his jacket, shaking him. "Do something. Tell them. Tell them she manipulated him. Vance looked uncomfortable. He tried to gently pry her fingers off his suit. Victoria, please, Vance muttered. We need to be careful with these accusations. I don't care, she screamed, her voice cracking. Look at her. Look at her sitting there. She's smiling. She planned this. She wants to ruin me. I was not smiling. I was watching. I was watching the disintegration of a person who had built her entire identity on a foundation of money that she never actually earned. Victoria turned back to Mercer. You are working with her, aren't you? She accused. How much did she pay you? How much is she giving you to fake these documents? Mercer looked at Victoria. A faint expression crossed his face for the first time. It was a look of mild distaste, like someone who had stepped in something unpleasant on the sidewalk. Ms. Kingsley, Mercer said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously quiet. You are accusing the International Fiduciary Office of Sterling and Graves of conspiracy and fraud. He let the words hang there. I would advise you to consider your next sentence very carefully. We have lawyers on retainer who cost more per hour than your company made in the last fiscal quarter. If you wish to accuse us of a crime, I suggest you have more than paranoia to back it up. But Victoria was past the point of reason. She was a drowning woman, and she was thrashing in the water, trying to pull anyone she could down with her. She forced him, Victoria yelled again, tears of rage streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. I know she did. He would never do this to me. He loved me. I was the favorite. I was the successful one. She glared at me, her eyes burning with hatred. You witch! You stole it! You stole my life! Judge Holloway slammed his gavel. Bang! Bang! Order! The judge bellowed. Ms. Kingsley, sit down immediately or I will have you removed for contempt. But the damage was done. The accusation was out. And in her desperate flailing, Victoria had just opened a door that she should have kept double-locked and barricaded. She had brought up the question of grandfather's mental state. She had brought up the question of influence. I looked at Mercer. He caught my eye. He didn't smile, but I saw a tiny tightening at the corner of his eye. Victoria had just walked right into the next trap. Judge Holloway did not scream. He did not bang his gavel again. Instead, he did something far more terrifying. He reached into the blue folder that Arthur Mercer had placed on his desk, turned a few pages with agonizing slowness, and then held up a single sheet of paper. Ms. Kingsley, the judge said. His voice was low, vibrating with a warning that sent a shiver down my spine. I strongly suggest you stop speaking. I suggest you take a breath, look at your attorney, and listen very carefully to what I'm about to read. Victoria was still standing, her chest heaving, her mouth open to launch another volley of insults, but something in the judge's eyes stopped her. It was the look of a man who was watching someone step off a cliff and was offering them one last chance to grab a branch. Mr. Vance, the judge said, shifting his gaze to the lawyer. You are a probate attorney. You are familiar with the concept of an in terrorem clause. Are you not? The color drained from Mr. Vance's face so quickly, it was as if a drain plug had been pulled in his heel. He looked at the document in the judge's hand, and then he looked at the specific page number. His eyes widened. He knew that section. He knew what kind of language usually lived in that section of a trust document. He reached out and grabbed Victoria's arm. His grip was hard, panicked. Victoria, stop, Vance hissed. Sit down. Don't say another word. Get off me, Victoria snapped, trying to shake him off. Why are you letting them talk to me like this? Shut up, Vance whispered harshly, abandoning all professional decorum. You don't understand. If that is a no-contest clause, you need to shut up right now. Judge Holloway adjusted his glasses. He looked down at the paper, then back at the courtroom. Clause 7, Section 2, the judge read aloud. The words were crisp, cutting through the silence like a guillotine blade. This provision is commonly known as a no-contest clause. He began to read the text of the clause. If any beneficiary under this trust, or any individual claiming to be a beneficiary, seeks to challenge the validity of this trust, or acts to impair, invalidate, or set aside any of its provisions, or files any legal action to assert control over the assets contained herein, through probate court, or any other venue. The judge paused, letting the legal jargon sink in. Then that individual shall forfeit any and all right, title, and interest they may have had under this trust. They shall be treated, for all purposes of distribution, as if they had predeceased the grantor without living issue. The room went dead silent. It was a trap, a beautiful, brutal, legally binding trap. Grandfather had not just locked the money away, he had rigged the door with explosives. He knew his family. He knew their greed. He knew that the moment he died, they would run to the nearest courthouse to try and break his arrangements. He knew they wouldn't be satisfied with a stipend or a managed allowance. He knew they would want it all, and they would want it now. So he had included a poison pill. If you accept the trust, you get something. If you fight the trust, you get nothing. Zero. I looked at Arthur Mercer. He was standing perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked like a chess grandmaster who had just watched his opponent move their queen directly into the line of fire. Judge Holloway lowered the paper. "Mr. Mercer," the judge asked, his voice grave, "as the trustee, how do you interpret the events of this morning?" Mercer turned his head slowly to look at the court stenographer's screen. "Where the morning's filings were logged, the language of the trust is explicit, Your Honor," Mercer said. His voice was devoid of malice, which made it all the more devastating. "It states that filing any legal action to assert control is the trigger. It does not require a trial. It does not require a verdict. The simple act of filing the paperwork is the violation." Mercer turned to look at Victoria, for the first time. He looked her up and down, not with curiosity, but with a cold finality. At 9 o'clock this morning, Ms. Victoria Kingsley filed an emergency motion for asset transfer, claiming sole authority over the estate, Mercer stated. She stood before this court and argued that the trust, assuming she knew of its existence or not, should be bypassed in favor of her immediate control. Mercer paused. By filing that motion, and by standing here today to argue for it, Ms. Kingsley has triggered Clause 7, Section 2. He looked back at the judge. As of this morning, Victoria Kingsley is no longer a beneficiary of the Silas Kingsley Trust. She has effectively disinherited herself. The implication hit Victoria like a physical blow. She staggered back, her legs hitting the edge of her chair. She slumped down, not because she chose to sit, but because her knees gave out. "Disinherited?" she whispered. She looked at Vance. Her eyes were wide, terrified. "Tell him he's wrong," she begged. "Vance, tell him. I didn't know. I didn't know there was a clause. I didn't even know there was a trust. You can't punish me for breaking a rule I didn't know existed." Vance was frantically flipping through his own legal pad, looking for a loophole, a precedent, anything. But his hands were shaking. He knew the law. Ignorance of a trust's existence is rarely a defense when you are aggressively trying to seize the assets through a different channel. "If it was a mistake," Vance stammered, addressing the judge, "Your Honor, my client was acting on the belief that the previous will was valid. She cannot be penalized for—" "She can, and she is." Judge Holloway cut him off. "The trust is the governing instrument. Mr. Kingsley had every right to include conditions. He made it very clear. Don't fight me. And you fought him." "No," Victoria screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and ugly. She jumped up again, her hands slamming onto the table. "I don't accept this. You can't take it away from me. It's mine. I earned it. I ran that company. I put up with his lectures and his old man smells and his boring stories for years. I earned that money." She pointed a shaking finger at the judge, then at Mercer. "This is a setup. You set me up." Then she turned to me. Her face was contorted, her makeup smeared, her hair coming loose from its perfect bun. She looked like an unraveling spool of thread. "And you," she shrieked at me. "You knew. You sat there and let me file. You let me walk into this." I said nothing. I didn't have to. The truth was, I didn't know about the clause specifically, but I knew my grandfather, and I knew that Victoria's own nature. Her impatience, her arrogance, her need to dominate would be her downfall. I didn't have to push her. I just had to watch her jump. He was crazy, Victoria yelled, her voice echoing off the walls. That is the only explanation. He was out of his mind. No sane father would do this to his own family. He was senile. He had dementia. She looked at her parents. Mom, Dad, tell them how he was forgetting names. Tell them how he got lost in the garden that one time. He wasn't competent to sign that trust. My mother, realizing that her own share of the money might be tied to Victoria's fate, nodded frantically. Yes, yes. He was very confused lately. He often thought it was 1990. Mr. Vance saw an opening. It was a desperate, dangerous opening. But it was the only one left. If the trust was valid, Victoria was broke. The only way to save her, and his fee, was to prove the trust itself was invalid. Your Honor, Vance shouted, finding his voice again, that is our motion. We challenge the capacity of the grantor. The courtroom went quiet again. Vance breathed heavily, adjusting his tie. If Silas Kingsley was not of sound mind when he signed this trust 6 months ago, then the entire document is void. Vance argued, his voice gaining strength. If the document is void, then the no contest clause is also void. You cannot violate a clause that shouldn't exist. Vance looked at Mercer, a glint of desperation in his eyes. We demand a hearing on capacity, Vance declared. We have testimony from the family. We have medical records showing his decline. We assert that Silas Kingsley was mentally incompetent and under undue influence when he signed that paper. Therefore, the trust is a nullity, and the original will stand. I felt a small, cold smile touch my lips. I couldn't help it. This was it. This was the moment. They thought they were fighting back. They thought they had found a lifeline. But they didn't understand. The no contest clause was just the first wall of the fortress. They had just used a battering ram to smash through the gate, only to find themselves standing in a courtyard filled with archers by challenging his capacity. They weren't saving themselves. They were inviting the world to see the evidence. Judge Holloway looked at Vance over the rim of his glasses. His expression was stern, almost dark. Counselor, the judge warned, you are treading on extremely thin ice. You are now formally moving to invalidate the trust based on lack of capacity? Yes, Your Honor, Vance said, straightening his jacket. We are, and you understand, the judge continued, that this is a serious allegation? You are accusing a major financial institution of facilitating a transaction with an incompetent person. You are accusing them of fraud. We are stating that the family knew him best, Vance said, hedging slightly, and the family says he was not well. Judge Holloway looked at Mercer. Mr. Mercer, the judge said, counsel has raised the issue of capacity. How does Sterling and Graves respond? Mercer did not look worried. In fact, he looked like a man who had been waiting for this exact sentence to be spoken. He reached into his briefcase again. We anticipated this specific line of attack. Mercer said, he pulled out a small, metallic object. It was a secure USB drive. In cases where the estate is significant and the family dynamic is volatile, Mercer said, choosing his words with surgical precision, Sterling and Graves requires a rigorous protocol for execution. We do not simply rely on a notary. Mercer walked forward and placed the drive on the clerk's desk. This drive contains the unedited, high-definition video recording of the signing ceremony. Mercer announced, it also contains the sworn affidavits of 3 independent psychiatrists who evaluated Mr. Kingsley immediately prior to the signing. It also contains the transcript of a private interview he gave to our compliance officer regarding his reasons for these decisions. Mercer turned to look at Vance, and then at Victoria. You say he was confused, Mercer said calmly. You say he didn't know what he was doing. I invite the court to watch the video and decide for itself. Victoria froze. Her mouth hung open. She had relied on the idea that grandfather was dead and couldn't speak for himself. She had relied on the fact that she could lie about his memory because there was no one to contradict her. But grandfather wasn't silent. He had recorded a message. Judge Holloway looked at the USB drive. He looked at the large monitor mounted on the wall for presenting evidence. "Clerk," the judge ordered, "plug that in." Vance raised a hand. "Your Honor, we haven't had time to review this evidence. You raised the issue of capacity 2 minutes ago. Mr. Vance," the judge snapped, "you opened this door. Now walk through it." The clerk took the drive. A moment later, the large screen flickered to life. I sat back in my bench. I folded my hands. I watched Victoria's face. She looked like she was about to be sick. She knew, deep down, that she was lying. She knew grandfather hadn't been senile. He had just been quiet. And she was about to learn that there is a very big difference between a man who has lost his mind and a man who has simply made up his mind. The screen turned blue, and then a video file appeared. The timestamp was from 6 months ago. Judge Holloway nodded. "Play it." The trap had snapped shut. And now, the executioner was about to speak. "Stop!" The word tore out of Victoria's throat, a desperate, jagged sound that bounced off the high ceiling of the courtroom. It was not a legal objection, it was a command, screamed with the frantic authority of someone watching their life burn down. The court clerk, who had been about to click the play icon on the large media screen, froze. Her hand hovered over the mouse, startled by the sheer violence in my sister's voice. "Do not play that video!" Victoria yelled. She pushed herself away from the table, standing up so abruptly that her heavy oak chair tipped backward and crashed to the floor with a deafening clatter. She pointed a shaking finger at the screen, then swung her arm around to point at me. "It is a fake! It is coerced! You cannot allow this to be seen!" Judge Holloway looked down from the bench, his eyebrows knitting together in a scowl of profound displeasure. "Ms. Kingsley, pick up your chair," the judge ordered, his voice like grinding stones. "You are in a court of law, not a reality television show. The evidence has been submitted. It will be reviewed." "No!" Victoria shrieked. Her face was flushed a blotchy, ugly red, the veins in her neck standing out like cords. "You do not understand. That video is not a will. It is a hostage tape." The room went deadly silent. Even Vance, who had been trying to grab her arm, pulled his hand back as if burned. "A hostage tape?" the judge repeated, his tone shifting from annoyance to dangerous curiosity. "Yes," Victoria panted, her chest heaving. She looked around the room, her eyes wide and manic, realizing she had everyone's attention. She decided to go all in. She decided to burn the bridge, the river, and the entire landscape if it meant saving herself. She looked at me with a hatred so pure it felt like radiant heat. Alberta held him prisoner. Victoria declared. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial hiss, intended to sound like the unveiling of a dark secret. For the last 6 months of his life, she isolated him. She moved into the estate and she changed the locks. She fired the staff that had been with us for years and replaced them with her own people. She turned to the judge, her hands spreading wide in a gesture of pleading. "Your Honor, my grandfather was a 90-year-old man. He was frail. He was dependent. Alberta took advantage of that. She controlled who he saw. She controlled who he spoke to. She controlled his medication." The lie was breathtaking. It was so audacious, so completely inverted from the truth, that for a moment I could only stare at her in admiration of her creativity. I hadn't changed the locks. Grandfather had changed them to keep her out after she stole a set of silver candlesticks to pay a gambling debt. I hadn't fired the staff. He had fired them because they were reporting his private conversations to Victoria. But the lie was gaining momentum. "She drugged him!" Victoria shouted, sensing she had found a foothold. I went to visit him in July. I remember it clearly. He was sitting in his wheelchair, drooling, staring at the wall. He didn't even know who I was. He was slurring his words. She pointed at me again. She was pumping him full of sedatives. She kept him in a chemical fog so she could manipulate him. She put the pen in his hand and forced him to sign those papers while he was high on painkillers. That video you are about to see, it is not a man making a decision. It is a man reading a script that she wrote. probably while she threatened to withhold his heart medication. The courtroom murmured. It was a horrific accusation. Abuse of the elderly was a trigger that made even the most cynical lawyers flinch. Mr. Vance, seeing the reaction, jumped on the grenade his client had thrown and tried to turn it into a weapon. "Your Honor, this changes everything," Vance said, his voice grave and urgent. "If what Ms. Kingsley says is true, we are looking at a felony. We are looking at elder abuse, false imprisonment, and coercion." Vance straightened his tie. Regaining his professional footing, "We demand an immediate freeze on all assets. We demand a subpoena for all medical records from the last 12 months of Silas Kingsley's life. And we demand that this so-called trust be suspended pending a full criminal investigation into the circumstances of its creation." He looked at me with a sneer. "You cannot probate a fruit of a poisonous tree. Your Honor, if Ms. Alberta obtained this control through chemical manipulation, she belongs in a cell, not in charge of a fortune." I felt a hand grip my shoulder. I flinched. It was my mother. She had stood up, her face wet with tears that seemed to appear on command. She leaned over the railing, looking at the judge with the woeful expression of a grieving Madonna. "It is true, Your Honor." My mother sobbed. Her voice was trembling, a perfect performance of maternal anguish. "We tried to see him. We tried so hard. I called the house every day, every single day. And she pointed a tragic finger at me. She would never let me speak to him. She always had an excuse. He is sleeping. He is sick. He is busy. I just wanted to tell my father-in-law that I loved him. I just wanted to say goodbye. But she kept him away from us. She stole our final moments with him." My father nodded vigorously beside her, playing the part of the stoic but heartbroken son. "She cut the phone lines," my father added, his voice gruff. "I drove up to the gates in August. The security guard, her guard, turned me away. Said I was trespassing on my own father's property. It was a symphony of lies, a coordinated, desperate assault on my character. They were painting a picture of a gothic horror story where I was the villainous nurse and grandfather was the helpless victim." I looked at Arthur Mercer. He was standing by the clerk's desk, one hand resting lightly on the polished wood. He had watched the entire performance without blinking. He did not look angry. He did not look worried. He looked like a biologist observing a colony of bacteria reacting to an antibiotic. Mercer waited until my mother's sobbing had reached a crescendo and Vance had finished his demand for a criminal probe. "Are you quite finished?" Mercer asked. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the hysteria like a cold wind. Victoria stopped panting. Vance turned to look at him. "You can stand there and look smug, Mr. Mercer," Vance spat. "But if your firm facilitated a signature from a medicated, coerced hostage, Sterling and Graves will be named as co-conspirators in the RICO lawsuit I am about to file." Mercer turned his head slowly to look at Vance. "Mr. Vance," Mercer said, his tone conversational, "do you honestly believe that an institution founded in 1824, which manages the sovereign wealth of 3 nations, would accept a mandate of this magnitude without performing basic due diligence?" Mercer tapped the black briefcase again. "We are not a strip mall notary service. We do not witness signatures on the hood of a car. When Silas Kingsley approached us, we initiated a Level 1 vetting protocol. He pointed to the USB drive that was still plugged into the clerk's computer. We predicted this accusation," Mercer said. "In fact, Mr. Kingsley predicted it. He told us explicitly, 'They will say I am crazy. They will say I was drugged. They will say my granddaughter Alberta forced me.'" Victoria went pale. "To counter this inevitable fiction," Mercer continued, his voice hardening, "we took precautions. The video you are trying to suppress does not just contain a statement from Mr. Kingsley. It begins with a 45-minute evaluation conducted by Dr. Aris Thorne, Dr. Sarah Jenkins, and Dr. Robert Liu." Vance's jaw dropped. Those were the 3 most respected forensic psychiatrists in Chicago. Their testimony was bulletproof. They conducted a full cognitive battery on Mr. Kingsley immediately prior to the signing. Mercer explained. They tested his memory, his reasoning, and his judgment. They also drew blood to screen for any pharmacological agents. Mercer looked at Victoria, his eyes cold and unforgiving. The toxicology report is on that drive, Ms. Kingsley. It confirms that your grandfather's system was completely clean of any sedatives, opiates, or mind-altering substances. He was sober, he was sharp, and he was 100% free. Mercer turned to the judge. The narrative of the prisoner in the tower is a fabrication. Your Honor, it is a lie constructed by desperate people who are realizing that the check is not in the mail. I ask that you play the video and let the dead man speak for himself. Judge Holloway looked at Vance. The lawyer looked sick. He knew he had just lost. He had bet the farm on a bluff, and his cards had been revealed as nothing but jokers. Play it, the judge ordered. The clerk clicked the mouse. The screen flickered from black to blue, and then resolved into a high-definition image. The room fell into a hush so deep I could hear the hum of the ventilation system. On the screen sat Silas Kingsley. He was sitting in his favorite leather wingback chair in the library. Behind him were the shelves of books I had spent years restoring. He was wearing his favorite charcoal cardigan and a crisp white shirt. He did not look frail. He did not look drugged. He sat with a spine of steel, his hands resting comfortably on the arms of the chair. His eyes, those piercing, intelligent gray eyes, looked directly into the camera lens. It felt as if he were looking through the screen, across time, and directly into the soul of everyone in the courtroom. My name is Silas Arthur Kingsley. The video, Silas said. His voice was strong, clear, and laced with that familiar dry wit that I missed so terribly. Today is August 15th, 2025. I am of sound mind, sound body, and unfortunately for my relatives, sound memory. On the screen, Silas leaned forward slightly. I am recording this statement to accompany the creation of the Silas Kingsley Irrevocable Trust. I am doing this to ensure that there is no ambiguity regarding my intentions. He paused, taking a sip of water from a crystal glass on the table next to him. I have been advised by my attorneys that my family may challenge this decision. I have been told they might accuse me of being senile, or perhaps they will accuse my granddaughter Alberta of manipulating me. In the courtroom, Victoria let out a small, strangled whimper. It was like watching a ghost read her diary. Let me be clear, Silas said, his voice hardening. Alberta has not asked for a penny. In fact, she is the only one who has never asked me for anything other than my time. She is the only Kingsley who knows the value of $1 is the work you put into earning it. He looked straight at the camera. As for the others, Silas sighed, a look of profound disappointment crossing his face. My son, Robert, is a weak man. He has spent 60 years waiting for me to die so he can finally feel like a big man. He has no vision, no courage, and no spine. He let his wife and daughter run roughshod over him because it was easier than leading. My father, sitting in the courtroom, shrank into his seat, his face burying itself in his hands. And Victoria Silas said the name with a mixture of sadness and distaste. My granddaughter Victoria believes she is a business genius because she knows how to spend money. She does not know how to make it. She is arrogant, cruel, and shallow. She does not love me. She tolerates me. She views me as an expiring ATM machine. The camera zoomed in slightly on his face. I have watched her dismantle the ethics of the company I built. I have watched her lie to investors. I have watched her treat her sister like a servant. I am not cutting her off because I'm crazy. I am cutting her off because I'm lucid. Silas pointed a finger at the lens. I am doing this to save what is left of my legacy from her greed. I am doing this because if I give her this money, she will destroy herself and everyone around her within a year. The video cut to a wide shot, showing the 3 doctors standing in the background, nodding, confirming his state, to the court. Silas concluded, Do not let them lie to you. My will is iron. My decision is final. The money goes to the trust. The control goes to Sterling and Graves, and my family gets exactly what they deserve. The opportunity to finally learn how to work for a living. The screen went black. For a moment. No one moved. The voice of the dead man still seemed to echo in the room, stripping away every lie, every pretension, every layer of quiet luxury that my family had wrapped themselves in. I looked at Victoria. She was not screaming anymore. She was not fighting. She was staring at the blank screen with an expression of absolute, hollowed-out horror. It wasn't just that she had lost the money. It was that she had been seen. Grandfather hadn't just disinherited her. He had dissected her. He had revealed to the world that her entire persona, the successful CEO, the loving granddaughter, the competent heir, was a fraud. He had stripped her naked in open court. The accusation of elder abuse hung in the air like a bad joke. The only abuse that had happened was the truth, beating them senseless. Judge Holloway cleared his throat. The sound was loud in the silence. He looked at Vance, his eyes hard. "Mr. Vance," the judge said quietly, "do you still wish to pursue your motion regarding the competency of the deceased? Or would you like to withdraw it before I refer your client to the district attorney for perjury?" Mr. Vance did not withdraw the motion. He stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water, gasping for air that simply wasn't there. The video of grandfather, lucid, sharp, and devastatingly honest, had sucked the oxygen out of his legal strategy. But Arthur Mercer was not a man who believed in leaving an enemy wounded on the battlefield. He believed in total annihilation. Mercer watched Vance struggle for a moment, then turned back to his briefcase. "The video establishes Mr. Kingsley's capacity," Mercer said, his voice terrifyingly conversational. "It proves he knew exactly what he was doing, but it does not address the other half of Miss Kingsley's accusation." He clicked the latch of the briefcase again. "Ms. Kingsley claims that she was denied access. She claims that the family was desperate to care for him, and that Alberta prevented this act of love. She claims that Alberta was the one drugging him." Mercer pulled out a book. It was not a legal binder. It was a simple, worn leather journal. The cover was cracked with age, and the edges were softened by handling. I recognized it immediately. It was the care diary that grandfather kept on his nightstand. He had started writing in it 3 years ago, not as a memoir, but as a log. He was a businessman to the end. He believed in documenting operations. "This is the care diary of Silas Kingsley," Mercer announced, holding it up like a holy relic. He recorded every visitor, every phone call, and every medical event for the last 36 months of his life. Mercer walked to the bench and handed the book to Judge Holloway. "I invite the court to look at the entries from last winter," Mercer said, "specifically, the dates surrounding the Christmas holidays." Judge Holloway took the book. He put his glasses back on, his hands moving with a reverence that had been absent earlier. He opened the pages. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the anticipation of another blow. The judge cleared his throat and began to read aloud. "December 24th, 2025. The judge read. His voice was steady, but I could hear the undercurrent of sadness. "Called Robert and Eleanor to wish them a Merry Christmas. No answer. Left voicemail. Called Victoria. Her assistant answered. Said Victoria was in Aspen and could not be disturbed. I ate dinner alone in the library with Alberta." The judge looked up. My parents looked down. My mother dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief, but she could not hide the flush of shame creeping up her neck. He flipped a few pages forward. January 10th. Fell in the hallway this morning, bruising on my hip. Called Robert. He picked up. Before I could tell him I was hurt. He asked if the quarterly dividend check had been mailed yet. I told him yes. He hung up. Did not ask how I was. A low murmur rippled through the few court staff present. This was not just negligence. It was a portrait of absolute, cold-blooded indifference. Judge Holloway turned another page, his frown deepening. February 14th. Victoria came to visit. Finally, she stayed for 12 minutes. She did not ask about my health. She brought documents for me to sign regarding a loan guarantee for her new condo project. When I told her I wanted to read them first, she became angry. She threw a vase, told me I was a stubborn old mule. She left without saying goodbye. The judge stopped reading. He looked at Victoria. "She threw a vase?" the judge asked, his voice incredulous. Victoria stood rigid, her face pale. It slipped. She stammered. "It was an accident," Mercer interrupted, his voice cutting like a whip. "And the entry from March 3rd? Mercer prompted. The judge found the date. He read it, and then he read it again. His face went hard. March 3rd. Woke up feeling groggy. Vision blurred. Realized my pill organizer had been tampered with. The yellow pills were missing. The blue ones were doubled. Victoria was here yesterday. She prepared my evening tea." The courtroom gasped. This was no longer just a story about a lonely old man. This was an accusation of poisoning. Victoria shook her head frantically. "No, that is a lie." He was confused. He mixed up his own meds. Mercer did not argue. He simply reached into his briefcase one last time. "We do not rely on the handwritten notes of a 90-year-old man to prove intent." Mercer said, "We rely on digital forensics." He pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printout of an email. "This is an email sent from the corporate account of Victoria Kingsley. To Dr. Lawrence Thorne, the former family physician, dated March 2nd, the day before the incident in the diary." Mercer held the paper up for the room to see. The subject line reads, "Dosage adjustment." He handed it to the clerk, who passed it to the judge, but Mercer did not need to read it. He had memorized it. "I will read the body of the email for the record," Mercer stated. He looked directly at Victoria. "Dr. Thorne, the old man, is becoming impossible. He is asking too many questions about the trust funds and the company accounts. We have a board meeting on Friday, and I cannot have him lucid enough to interfere. Increase the sedative dosage in his evening pack. Make him sleep. If he is groggy, he is compliant. I don't care about the side effects. Just keep him out of my way." The silence that followed was total. It was the silence of a grave. This was not a civil dispute anymore. This was evidence of a conspiracy to commit assault with a controlled substance. It was evidence of premeditated harm. Judge Holloway looked at the email. He looked at the header, verifying the sender, the recipient, the date. His hands were shaking slightly, not from age, but from anger. He looked up at Victoria. His expression was no longer judicial. It was human, and it was disgusted. "You asked a doctor to overdose your grandfather because he was asking questions about his own money?" the judge asked. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried to the back of the room. Victoria opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at Vance. "But Mr. Vance was moving. He was physically stepping away from the table. He picked up his briefcase and took 2 large steps to the left, putting 5 feet of distance between himself and his client. "It was the universal legal gesture for I am not going down with this ship. I was not aware of this correspondence," Vance said loudly. Addressing the bench, "Your Honor, let the record show that counsel had absolutely no knowledge of any medical interference or communication with Dr. Thorne regarding sedation." He looked at Victoria with a mixture of fear and loathing. "I am recusing myself from this matter effective immediately." Vance declared, "I cannot represent a client who has concealed evidence of criminal conduct." Victoria stood alone. The white Armani suit, which had looked so powerful an hour ago, now looked like a shroud. She looked at her parents. My father was staring at the floor, refusing to meet her eyes. My mother was holding her hand over her mouth, rocking back and forth. They were abandoning her, just like they had abandoned grandfather. I felt a surge of cold, sharp clarity. It was time. I stood up. "You did not just want the money." "Victoria," I said. My voice was steady. It cut through the room, drawing her eyes to me. She looked at me, and I saw the terror behind the rage. "You wanted to erase him." I said, "You didn't just want his wealth. You wanted his silence. You couldn't stand the fact that he saw you. He saw exactly what you were. So you tried to turn him into a ghost before he was even dead. I took a step toward her. You drugged him not because he was sick, but because he was asking where the money went. I said, you needed him asleep so you could rob him blind. Something inside Victoria snapped. The pressure, the debt, the lies, the public humiliation, the loss of the fortune, finally caused the vessel to burst. Shut up, she screamed. It was a primal, ugly sound. She slammed her hands onto the table. Leaning over it, her face twisted into a snarl. You don't know anything. You sit there with your dusty books and your moral superiority. You have no idea what it costs to be me. She pounded her chest. I needed that money. I have loans due next week. I have creditors calling my house at 3 a.m. The confession poured out of her like vomit. She couldn't stop it. I mortgaged everything, she shrieked. The condo, the office. I even forged Dad's signature to get a line of credit on the lake house. My father's head snapped up. What? He gasped. I had to, Victoria yelled at him. You weren't giving me enough. The company was bleeding cash. I had to prop up the stock price. I thought when the old man died, I could pay it all back before anyone noticed. She looked at the judge, her eyes wide and crazy. I just needed the transfer. If I got the $500 million, I could fix it. I could pay off the banks. I could pay off the dark money lenders. I could make it all go away. She was crying now, ugly, gasping sobs. But you ruined it, she screamed at Mercer. You locked it away. Now they are going to come for me. They are going to kill me if I don't pay. She had said too much. She had admitted to fraud. She had admitted to forgery. She had admitted to a motive for the sedation. Judge Holloway banged his gavel. Bang, bang, bang. Order, the judge shouted. Ms. Kingsley, silence. But the silence that fell was the silence of a crime scene after the gun has been fired. The smoke was clearing, and the bodies were visible. Victoria stood there, panting, realizing what she had just done. She had confessed to multiple felonies on the court record. She had destroyed herself. Judge Holloway looked at her with eyes of steel. This court has heard enough, the judge said. He turned to the bailiff. Officer, ensure that Ms. Kingsley does not leave this room. Then he turned to the clerk. Seal the medical records and the email correspondence presented by Mr. Mercer. I am referring this entire file, including the transcript of today's hearing, to the Cook County State's Attorney Office. The judge looked at Vance, then at my parents, and finally at Victoria. We are well beyond probate law now, the judge said grimly. We are looking at fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit bodily harm. Victoria slumped into her chair. She looked small. The power was gone. The money was gone. And judging by the look on my father's face as he realized she had mortgaged his house, her family was gone too. I looked at Mercer. He closed his briefcase. The click was soft, final. He had not fired a single bullet. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply walked in with the truth and let them tear themselves apart against the sharp edges of it. But he wasn't finished. I could see it in his eyes. There was one more domino left to fall. Arthur Mercer stood by the clerk's desk, his hand still resting on the latch of his black briefcase. The room was vibrating with the aftershocks of Victoria's confession, a chaotic energy that bounced off the wood-paneled walls. But Mercer was not done. He looked at my sister, who was slumped in her chair, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto a dock, and he opened his mouth to deliver the final, fatal stroke. There is one final matter regarding the assets, Mercer said. His voice cut through the sobbing and the murmurs of the court staff. It was calm, precise, and devoid of mercy. Ms. Kingsley, you mentioned your company. You mentioned your desperate need to prop up the stock price of Velvet Horizon. You mentioned that you are the CEO. Mercer paused, tilting his head slightly to the side. Correction, Mercer said. You were the CEO. Victoria looked up, her eyes red and swollen. What? The Silas Kingsley Trust does not merely hold cash and real estate, Mercer explained. Addressing the room at large, it holds the controlling interest in the family holding company, specifically, The trust possesses 51% of the voting shares of Kingsley Enterprises, which is the parent company of your real estate venture. He checked his watch. It was a reflex of habit, not necessity. At 8 o'clock this morning, acting as the trustee with majority voting power, Sterling and Graves convened an emergency shareholder meeting. Victoria shook her head. You can't do that. I am the chairwoman of the board. We removed you from the board at 8:15. Mercer said simply, and at 8:30, we passed a motion to terminate your employment as chief executive officer, effective immediately, for cause. For cause? Victoria whispered. Gross moral turpitude, financial mismanagement, and actions detrimental to the reputation of the Kingsley name. Mercer listed, we also voted to liquidate the assets of Velvet Horizon to cover the debts of the parent company. Your project is dead. Ms. Kingsley, your title is gone. You are currently trespassing on corporate property if you still have your company phone in your pocket. As if on cue, a sound erupted from the plaintiff's table. It was my father's phone. Then Victoria's phone, which was lying on the table, lit up. Then Mr. Vance's phone, tucked in his abandoned briefcase, began to vibrate against the floor. It was a chorus of electronic panic. My father fumbled for his device, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He looked at the screen, and his face went the color of ash. It's the news. My father stammered. It's on Bloomberg. It's on CNBC. Kingsley heiress ousted. Stock plummets. He looked at Victoria with horror. Velvet Horizon is down 60% in pre-market trading. He gasped. Victoria. My options, my retirement fund was in that stock. Victoria grabbed her own phone. Her fingers swiped across the screen, her eyes darting back and forth as she read the headlines that were destroying her life in real time. Fraud allegations. Rock Chicago real estate. Sterling and Graves seizes control of Kingsley Empire. Victoria Kingsley. Fired. No. She moaned. No, no, no. Stop it. Make it stop. She looked at Mercer, pleading now. You can't do this. If the stock crashes, the margin calls will hit. I have loans secured against those shares. If the price drops below $10, they will call the debt. Mercer looked at her. It is currently trading at $4.50. He said. The blood drained from Victoria's face. That was it. The math was undeniable. She wasn't just broke. She was buried. The margin calls would trigger an automatic liquidation of everything she owned. Her condo, her car, her jewelry, her clothes. It was all gone. But the destruction was not finished. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom opened again. I expected another lawyer. I expected a reporter. But the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from civil tension to criminal dread. 4 people walked in. They did not walk like civilians. They moved with a tactical precision, scanning the room, their hands resting near their waists. 2 of them wore navy blue windbreakers with yellow lettering on the back. 2 wore cheap, ill-fitting suits that marked them as federal agents. The man in the lead, a tall officer with a grim face, walked past the bar. He did not look at the judge for permission. He looked at the judge with a nod of professional acknowledgement. Judge Holloway nodded back. He had been expecting them. The officer walked straight to the plaintiff's table. He stopped in front of Victoria. Victoria Kingsley? The officer asked. Victoria stared at the badge hanging from his belt. It was a gold star. U.S. Marshal. Behind him stood a woman holding a tablet. Her jacket lapel pulled back to reveal the letters FBI. Victoria did not answer. She couldn't. Her throat had closed up. Ms. Kingsley, the officer said, his voice loud and formal. I have a federal warrant for your arrest. The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that had preceded them. Arrest? My mother shrieked. She jumped up, grabbing my father's arm. Robert, do something! They are arresting her. My father sat paralyzed. He was watching his net worth evaporate on his phone screen. He didn't have the energy to fight the United States government. The officer pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. The metal glinted under the harsh courtroom lights. You are charged with 4 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of bank fraud, and 1 count of securities fraud. The officer recited. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. The FBI agent stepped forward. We also have a state warrant attached, she added, for elder abuse and conspiracy to commit intentional injury with a controlled substance. Victoria looked at the handcuffs. She looked at her white Armani sleeves. She looked at the Cartier bracelet on her wrist. This isn't real, she whispered. This is a mistake. I am Victoria Kingsley. You can't arrest me. I know the mayor. The marshal didn't care who she knew. He reached out, grabbed her left wrist, and twisted her arm behind her back. Ms. Kingsley, please place your hands behind your back, he ordered. Ow, you're hurting me, Victoria yelled, struggling. Don't touch me. Turn around, the marshal barked. Losing patience, he forced her around. Click, the sound of the first cuff locking was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a gate slamming shut. Click, the second cuff locked. Victoria Kingsley, the CEO, the socialite, the golden child, was now a prisoner. The FBI agent began to read her rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Victoria was crying loudly now. Not the fake, pretty tears she used to manipulate our parents, but ugly, guttural sobs of pure terror. Daddy, help me. Call the lawyers. Call someone. My father finally moved. He stood up, his face red with a mixture of shame and indignation. Officer, look here, my father blustered, trying to summon the ghost of his former authority. This is a misunderstanding. My daughter is a businesswoman. She is not a criminal. We can clear this up at the station. There is no need for handcuffs. It is excessive. The marshal turned to look at my father. He looked him up and down with a sneer of contempt. Sir, your daughter leveraged $20 million in fraudulent loans using a trust she didn't own as collateral. The marshal said, she faked documents, she lied to federally insured banks, and she drugged a 90-year-old man to cover her tracks. The marshal stepped closer to my father. And unless you want us to look very closely at who co-signed those loan applications, I suggest you sit down and shut your mouth. My father froze. His mouth snapped shut. He knew, deep down. He knew he had signed papers he hadn't read. He knew he had looked the other way when Victoria brought home contracts that seemed too good to be true. He realized, in that terrifying second, that he was standing on the edge of the same abyss. He sat down. He slumped into his chair. Looking away from his daughter, Victoria saw it. She saw her father choose his own safety over hers. Daddy? She whimpered. My mother was wailing, a high-pitched sound of distress, but she didn't move toward her daughter. She clutched her purse, her eyes darting around the room, terrified that the officers might have a pair of cuffs for her too. The house of cards had not just fallen, it had been incinerated. The entire scheme, the loans, the lifestyle, the arrogance, had been built on one single premise, that grandfather would die, and the money would flow. They had bet their lives on it. And because the trust had cut the flow, the vacuum created a collapse so violent it was pulling the entire family structure down with it. The marshal grabbed Victoria's arm. Let's go. They began to march her out. The white suit was wrinkled now. Her hair was a mess. She stumbled in her expensive heels, unable to use her arms for balance. She passed by me. For a second, the procession stopped as the marshal adjusted his grip. Victoria stood 3 feet away from me. She looked at me. Her eyes were wild, rimmed with smeared mascara. I hate you, she hissed. You did this. You planned this. I looked back at her. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. I expected to feel joy. I expected to feel the thrill of victory. I had watched this moment in my head 1,000 times. I had imagined her downfall. But I didn't feel joy. I felt cold. It was a clean, clinical coldness. It was the feeling of cutting away gangrene. It wasn't happy work, but it was necessary work. It was the feeling of scrubbing a stain out of a precious book until the paper was white again. I didn't plan your greed, Victoria, I said softly, and I didn't sign your loan documents. You did this to yourself. She lunged at me, but the marshal jerked her back. "Move it!" the officer shouted. They dragged her toward the doors. The FBI agents followed, carrying boxes of evidence they had seemingly materialized from the hallway. The doors swung open. I could see the flash of cameras in the hallway outside. The press had arrived. They were waiting for the heiress in handcuffs shot. Victoria screamed as the camera flashes hit her. "No! No photos! Get away from me!" The doors closed, cutting off her screams. The room was suddenly quiet again. The buzzing of the phones had stopped. My parents sat alone at the plaintiff's table. There was an empty chair between them where their golden child had been. They looked small. They looked old. They looked like two people who had just realized that they were bankrupt in every sense of the word, financially, morally, and emotionally. Arthur Mercer stood by the bench. He adjusted his cuff. He picked up his briefcase. He looked at me and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The trap had worked perfectly. The prey had been caught. The financial machinery of Sterling and Graves had crushed the threat with the efficiency of a hydraulic press. But as I looked at my parents, shivering in the ruins of their arrogance, I knew it wasn't quite over. There was one last desperate gasp left in this tragedy. I could feel it. The technology. The passwords. Victoria wasn't the only one who had tried to steal the future. My father was reaching for his phone again, his fingers twitching with the muscle memory of a man who thinks he can still make one last transfer before the lights go out. Just as the heavy oak doors were about to close, cutting off the flashes of the cameras and the roar of the press, Victoria twisted her body violently in the grip of the U.S. Marshal. She managed to jam her foot against the doorframe, keeping it open for one terrified, chaotic second. She didn't look at me. She looked past the rows of empty benches, locking eyes with our father. "Dad!" she screamed, her voice raw with panic. "The Cayman server! Do it now!" The marshal yanked her back, his patience exhausted. "Move!" the officer barked, but Victoria fought him, desperation giving her a frantic, hysterical strength. "Dad!" she yelled again, spitting the words out as if they were a spell that could save her soul. Authorization code. Delta 9. Call, Dav. She stopped herself, her eyes widening as she realized she was about to shout the name of an illicit contact in front of federal agents. She swallowed the name, pivoting mid-scream. "Call the tech! Call the IT guy! Run the override! Execute it now!" The marshal finally dislodged her foot. He shoved her through the gap. The doors slammed shut with a final, resonant thud. The silence that returned to the courtroom was not peaceful. It was electric. It was the silence of a fuse burning down. My father sat frozen at the plaintiff's table. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He had just watched his daughter, his pride and joy, be dragged away in irons. But underneath the shock, something else was firing in his brain. A survival instinct, a greedy, desperate lizard brain reflex that Victoria's scream had activated. The Cayman server. I saw his eyes dart to the phone that was still clutched in his trembling hand. He knew what she was talking about. Of course he knew. There was always a backup plan. There was always a secret account, a slush fund hidden behind shell companies and encrypted firewalls. Designed for exactly this kind of rainy day, Victoria must have set up a failsafe, a digital escape hatch to drain whatever liquidity was left before the accounts were frozen. He looked at the judge. Judge Holloway was writing something on his docket, his head down. He looked at the bailiff. The bailiff was looking at the door where the marshals had exited. He looked at me. I stared right back at him. I didn't move. I didn't shout. I just watched. He made his choice. Robert Kingsley, a man who had never done an honest day's physical labor in his life, moved with a sudden, jerky speed. He hunched over the table, using his body to shield the phone from the bench. His fingers flew across the screen. I could see the reflection of the blue light on his glasses. He was sweating profusely, beads of moisture dripping from his nose onto the mahogany table. He was typing in the code. Delta 9. Next to me, Arthur Mercer stood like a statue carved from obsidian. He was perfectly relaxed, his breathing even. But as my father's thumbs hammered against the glass, Mercer's left wrist lit up. His smartwatch. It was a sleek, tactical device, the screen normally dark. Now, it pulsed with a soft, red glow. A single vibration hummed in the quiet air. Bzzzt. Mercer lifted his wrist. He glanced at the notification with the casual interest of a man checking the weather forecast. He lowered his arm and leaned slightly toward me. "They are trying to hack the secondary payment gateway," Mercer whispered. His voice was so low only I could hear it. I looked at him, alarmed. "Can they do it? Can they move the money?" Mercer didn't answer immediately. He watched my father. Robert was tapping frantically now. He had entered the code. He was hitting the execute button. I could imagine the interface on his screen. A progress bar. A spinning wheel. The promise of millions of dollars siphoned off to a safe haven in the Caribbean. "Dad, stop," I whispered, though I knew he couldn't hear me. My father's face was contorted in a grimace of concentration. "Come on," his lips mouthed. "Come on. Come on." Mercer smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was a cold, razor-sharp expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "He is attempting to access the Shadow Lake ledger," Mercer murmured to me. "It is a dormant account your grandfather left open specifically for this moment." Suddenly, my father gasped. It was a loud, strangled sound, like someone had punched him in the gut. He stared at his phone. He tapped the screen again. Harder this time. Then he swiped. Then he shook the phone, as if the device itself were broken. The red reflection on his glasses intensified. Mercer checked his watch again. Access denied. Mercer said softly, "On the other side of the room." My father's screen was flashing a bright, aggressive red. Huge. Block letters were pulsing on the display. I didn't need to see them to know what they said. The system had locked him out. The firewall Sterling and Graves had built was not made of wood. It was made of diamond. My father let out a whimper of pure despair. No, he tried again. He was frantic now, abandoning all stealth. He was stabbing at the screen with his index finger, trying to re-enter the code, trying to bypass the blockade. Judge Holloway looked up. The sound of my father's fingernails clicking against the glass screen echoed in the acoustic perfection of the courtroom. "Tick, tick, tick, tick. Mr. Kingsley?" the judge asked. His voice was sharp. My father jumped. He looked up, guilt written across every inch of his face. He tried to hide the phone under the table, but his hands were shaking too badly. He dropped it. Clatter. The phone spun across the floor, coming to rest in the middle of the aisle, the screen still glowing red, broadcasting its warning to the ceiling. Judge Holloway stood up. He looked at the phone, then at my father. He realized instantly what had just happened. "Bailiff!" the judge shouted, pointing at the device. "Seize that phone immediately!" My father scrambled out of his chair. "No, that's private property. You can't—" "Sit down," the judge bellowed. "You are attempting to dissipate assets during an active fraud investigation. That is a federal crime." "Sir." The bailiff, a large man who had been waiting for something to do all morning, moved with surprising speed. He scooped up the phone. He looked at the screen. "Your Honor," the bailiff announced, his voice booming. "It appears to be a banking interface. It says, 'Transfer failed. Security protocol activated.'" Judge Holloway's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. "You foolish man," the judge hissed at my father. "Your daughter is in handcuffs, and your first instinct is to try and commit another felony right in front of me?" My father collapsed back into his chair. He looked small. He looked like a deflated balloon. I was just checking my balance. He lied weakly. Judge Holloway was not having it. "Officer," the judge commanded, "take Mr. Kingsley into custody." "What?" my mother screamed. She had been sitting in a daze. But this snapped her back to reality. "No, not Robert. He didn't do anything. He just attempted to wire funds from a frozen estate," the judge shouted back. "That is obstruction of justice. That is attempted grand larceny." 2 more deputies entered from the side door. They didn't need to be told. They marched over to the plaintiff's table. My father didn't fight. He didn't have Victoria's rage. He just had a hollow, cowardly resignation. He stood up slowly, holding his hands out. I'm sorry. Eleanor, he whispered to my mother. They cuffed him. Click, click. My mother watched as they spun him around. She looked at the empty chair where Victoria had been. She looked at the empty chair where her husband had been. She looked at the empty table. Then she looked at me. Her eyes were wide, unseeing. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her knees gave way, and she slid off her chair, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of navy silk and expensive perfume. She didn't faint. She just crumpled, the structural integrity of her life finally giving way under the weight of her family's sins. I watched the deputies lead my father out. He walked with a shuffle, his head down, looking at his shoes. He looked like an old man. I felt a hand on my elbow. I turned. Arthur Mercer was standing close to me. He was looking at the phone in the bailiff's hand. You should know, Mercer said quietly. His voice was calm, a stark contrast to the chaos of my mother's sobbing on the floor. That account your father tried to access? The Shadow Lake ledger? I nodded, unable to speak. It was a honeypot. Mercer explained. I blinked. A what? A trap. Mercer said, Mr. Kingsley set it up 3 years ago. He put a small amount of money in it, about $50,000, and left the access codes in a file he knew Victoria would find. He knew that if she ever got desperate, she would try to use it. Mercer adjusted his cufflink. But the account is not connected to the bank. He continued. It is connected to a silent alarm system. He pointed to the phone. The moment your father hit execute, the software did not attempt to transfer money. It transmitted the GPS coordinates of the device, the IP address, and the biometric data of the user directly to the Cybercrimes Division of the FBI. I stared at him. Grandfather had weaponized his own bank account by pressing that button. Mercer said, a hint of admiration in his voice. Your father just digitally signed his own confession. He proved intent. He proved knowledge of the illicit codes. He just handed the prosecutor a bow-wrapped conviction for high-tech fraud. I looked at the door where my father had disappeared. They never had a chance. I whispered, no. Mercer agreed. They were playing checkers. Silas Kingsley was playing three-dimensional chess, and he won. The room was clearing out. Medics were coming in for my mother, who was now weeping hysterically on the floor, clutching her pearls as if they were the only things tethering her to the earth. The bailiff handed the phone to the clerk to be bagged as evidence. The judge was signing the detention order. The collapse was total. Victoria was gone. Robert was gone. Eleanor was broken. The empire they had tried to steal had turned around and devoured them, and I was left standing in the wreckage, the only one untouched by the explosion. Mercer picked up his briefcase. Shall we? He asked. He gestured toward the exit, away from the scene of the crime. I looked at my mother one last time. I felt a pang of sadness, sharp and deep. But it was the sadness you feel for a character in a tragedy who refuses to learn their lesson until the final curtain falls. I couldn't save her. I couldn't save any of them. Grandfather had tried, in his own harsh way, to teach them, but they wouldn't listen. Now, the lesson was over. I turned my back on the plaintiff's table. Yes, I said, let's go. The silence that followed the chaos was heavy, but it was not oppressive. It was the kind of silence that settles over a forest after a storm has passed. The air stripped clean. The dead wood cleared away, leaving only what is strong enough to remain standing. The courtroom was empty now. The gallery benches, which had briefly held the weight of my mother's collapse and the press's frenzy, were bare wood again. The bailiff had left to process the evidence. The clerk had gone to file the sealed orders. There were only 3 of us left. Judge Holloway, sitting high on his bench, Arthur Mercer, standing by the plaintiff's table like a guardian statue, and me. I remained in my seat for a long moment, listening to the only sound in the room, the scratch of a fountain pen against paper. Scritch, scratch, scritch. Judge Holloway was signing the final orders. He moved with a deliberate slowness, reading every line before affixing his signature. He was not just closing a case, He was sealing a tomb. He finished the last document, closed the file, and set his pen down. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, looking suddenly older, but also lighter. "Miss Kingsley," the judge said softly. I looked up. "Yes, Your Honor?" The judge looked down at me. His expression was no longer the stern mask of the law. It was the tired, kindly look of a man who had seen too much human ugliness and was relieved to finally see something else. "I have signed the order formally recognizing the Silas Kingsley Irrevocable Trust as the sole governing instrument of the estate," he said. "I have also signed a summary judgment dismissing all claims made by your sister and issuing sanctions against her legal counsel for filing frivolous and fraudulent motions." He paused, leaning forward slightly. "I rarely say this, Miss Kingsley, but I am sorry for what you had to witness today. Family court is a blood sport, but I have never seen a family work so hard to destroy itself." I nodded slowly. "Thank you, Your Honor, but I think they destroyed themselves a long time ago. Today was just the funeral." The judge nodded. He looked at Mercer. "Mr. Mercer, the court recognizes Sterling and Graves as the trustee. The assets are yours to administer. Please ensure that the transfer fees are paid to the clerk on your way out." "Of course," Judge Mercer said, bowing his head slightly. Judge Holloway stood up. He gathered his robe around him. "Good luck, Miss Kingsley. I have a feeling you will do more with this life than your sister ever could." He turned and vanished into his chambers. I stood up. My legs felt steady now. The trembling was gone. Mercer walked over to me. For the first time, he abandoned the rigid formality of his position. He didn't look like a terrifying force of nature anymore. He looked like a man who had completed a difficult mission. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He did not pull out a document. He pulled out a small velvet box. He held it out to me. "This is for you," Mercer said. I took the box. It was light. I opened it. Inside sat a single, heavy brass key. It looked old, the metal tarnished with the patina of age, but the teeth were cut sharp and new. "This is the key to safe deposit box number 401 at the downtown branch of Sterling and Graves," Mercer explained. I looked at the key, then at him. "What is in it?" Mercer smiled. It was a genuine smile this time, one that reached his eyes. "The future," he said. He gestured to the empty table where Victoria had sat. "Your grandfather knew that Victoria wanted the money to spend it. She wanted the power to consume, but he knew you were different. He knew you were a restorer. You take broken things and you make them whole again." Mercer lowered his voice. "The trust dictates that the commercial assets, the stocks, the companies, the liquid cash, will be managed by us to ensure growth. But the key you are holding controls the Silas Kingsley Charitable Foundation. It also grants you sole, executive title to the Kingsley Historical Estate and the library." I felt a lump form in my throat. The library. He didn't leave you the money to buy yachts. "Alberta," Mercer said gently, "he left you the resources to preserve history. He left you the mandate to protect the things he loved. You have an operating budget of $50 million a year, specifically designated for preservation projects, educational grants, and the maintenance of the estate. $50 million. It was a staggering number, but unlike Victoria, who saw numbers as fuel for her ego, I saw it as glue to fix bindings, glue to save buildings, glue to keep history from falling apart. But there was one question that had been burning in my chest since the moment Mercer walked through those doors. "Mr. Mercer," I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Why didn't he tell me?" Mercer tilted his head. "Why did I have to sit here and be terrified?" I asked. "Why did I have to listen to them insult me? Why did he let me think I was poor and helpless until the very last second? He could have told me about the trust. He could have told me about you. We could have avoided this whole spectacle." Mercer shook his head slowly. "No, Alberta. We could not have avoided it." He took a step closer to me. "Silas knew his family better than anyone. He knew that if you knew about the trust beforehand." "You are a terrible liar." I blinked. "Excuse me?" Mercer chuckled softly. "You are an honest woman." "Alberta, It is your greatest strength. But in a legal battle, it is a liability. If you had walked into this courtroom knowing that you had a billion-dollar ace up your sleeve, your face would have shown it. You would have looked smug. You would have looked guilty. Mercer looked at the door where the police had taken my family. Not because of your blood, but because of your character. I looked down at the brass key in my hand. It felt warm. He trusted me. I said, Mercer buttoned his jacket. He trusted you enough to put you through hell, knowing you would walk out of it without burning. Mercer picked up his briefcase. My car is outside, he said. I can drive you to the bank if you wish to access the box immediately. I shook my head. No, not yet. I think I need to walk. I need some air. Mercer nodded. Of course. We will be in touch on Monday to finalize the paperwork. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor with the same rhythmic precision as when he arrived. Click, clack, click, clack. I watched him go. Then, I turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. I pushed them open. The hallway was empty. The press had followed the police cars outside. The flashes were gone. The shouting was gone. I walked down the long corridor, past the portraits of dead judges who watched me with indifferent eyes. I took the elevator down to the lobby. I walked out the front revolving doors of the courthouse. The air hit me first. It was a typical Chicago afternoon in late autumn. The sky was the color of wet slate, a low, heavy gray that threatened rain. The wind was sharp, cutting off the lake with a bite that usually made me shiver. But today, it didn't feel cold. It felt clean. It felt like the air inside a vault that had just been opened after 100 years. It tasted of ozone and wet pavement and freedom. I stood on the steps of the courthouse, down the street, about a block away. I saw the flashing lights. 2 police cruisers were pulling away from the curb, their sirens chirping briefly as they merged into traffic. I saw the silhouette of a woman in the back seat of the first car. She was slumped against the window. I couldn't see her face, but I knew who it was. I knew she was probably still crying, still blaming the world, still trying to calculate a way out of a math problem that had no solution. I watched the car turn the corner and disappear. I waited for the tears. I waited for the guilt to wash over me. That was my sister. That was my blood. But the tears didn't come. Instead, I felt a lightness in my chest that was so profound it made me dizzy. The weight of them. The years of insults. The constant demands. The emotional blackmail. The frantic need to please people who could not be pleased. It was all gone. It had been driven away in the back of a squad car. I wasn't alone. I was free. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It was an old model. The screen cracked in the corner because I hadn't wanted to spend the money to fix it. I dialed a number. It rang twice before a breathless voice answered. Alberta? Is that you? Are you okay? I saw the news. They said Victoria was arrested. They said it was Sarah, my assistant at the restoration studio. She sounded terrified. I'm fine. Sarah, I said. My voice was steady. It was stronger than it had been this morning. Oh, thank God. Sarah exhaled. I was so worried. Did they take the inheritance? Do we need to close the shop? I looked out at the gray skyline of Chicago. I looked at the towering buildings of steel and glass. No. Sarah, I said, we don't need to close the shop. In fact, I need you to do something for me. Anything, she said. Do you remember that project we talked about last year? The complete restoration of the manuscript collection? The one we said we couldn't afford because the vellum was too expensive? Yes? Sarah asked, confused. Order the vellum. I said, order the gold leaf. Order the best binding leather from Italy. Hire the 2 extra apprentices we talked about. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Alberta. That sounds like a lot of money. Are you sure? I smiled. I gripped the brass key in my other hand. I am sure. I said, we have the funding. We have the funding for everything now. I started walking down the steps, my heels clicking on the concrete. And Sarah? One more thing. Yes? Draft a press release. I said, we are renaming the studio, and we are renaming the restoration wing of the city library. "What are we calling it?" she asked. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs. I looked up at the sky, letting the cold wind hit my face. "Call it the Silas Library," I said. I hung up the phone. I put it back in my pocket. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself and stepped onto the sidewalk. The city was moving around me, loud and chaotic and alive. People were rushing to lunch. Cars were honking. The L train rumbled overhead. For the first time in 32 years, I didn't feel like I was watching the world from the sidelines. I was in it. I had a purpose. I had the means. And most importantly, I had the truth. My sister was in a cell. My parents were in an interrogation room, but I was here. I began to walk, disappearing into the crowd. Not as a victim, not as a ghost, but as the architect of my own life. The man in the black suit had closed the book on the past. It was time for me to write the next chapter. Thank you so much for listening to this story on Sunday Drama Stories. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening while driving to work in London? Cooking dinner in Sydney? Or maybe relaxing in a cafe in New York? Please leave a comment below and share your location so we can see how far this story has traveled. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and revenge, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this video reach even more people who love a good drama. See you in the next story.